We're back with an alarming new report that came out this past week on the state of the world's oceans.
32% of plastic packaging ends up littering the environment. 40% is sitting in a landfill somewhere. 14% is incinerated. 14% is recycled. But only 2% is effectively recycled.
Downhill from the prison, downhill from the mall, downhill from the factory farm and the hospital.
It's not reasonable at all that we continue to live like this.
Downhill from the border wall, downhill from everywhere, downhill from all you see. The ocean is downhill from gravity.
About 8 million metric tons go into the ocean every year. That's the equivalent of one city garbage truck dumping a load of plastic into the ocean every minute of every day.
This is the story of plastics. It is fossil fuels finding a new form and finding a new place to flow through the economy.
The surge of attention to plastic pollution is pretty striking.
Think of the ocean as yours. Do you think about it at all?
I believe we're at a tipping point right now. I've seen more policy change globally in the last 8 months than I've seen in 20 years of my career. Because not only are governments getting pissed off, but companies are recognizing they can't get away with it anymore.
I don't think they can keep on tricking people forever.
I want to start by thanking everybody. I'm very pleased to say that registration went far beyond our expectations. People kept contacting me and saying, can we bring someone else onto this? And we were very happy about that. So we had to contact the Story of Plastic people, and they were very happy about that. So thank you all very much for spreading the word and for coming and attending. Not everyone out there is familiar with the Leadership in the Environment podcast, the podcast that started this all. And it's now, actually next month, it will turn 3 years old. Very excited about that, and we formed a team behind it. We're actually now switching it over, so we're rebranding as This Sustainable Life. And some of you saw our new rebranding. We're very excited about that. And so for more on sustainability leadership, including the podcast episodes with the guests that are here tonight, please go to the podcast and subscribe. Now, one top question that is almost certain to come up, and I'm going to give a quick answer to this just to start things off, is what can I do? Now, I can't give everybody a full comprehensive answer, but if you don't know about me, you might know that I take a little over a year, now close to 2 years, to fill one load of garbage in my home. And a few years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, when I started that, trying to use less plastic and other waste, I emptied my garbage about once a week. And if you had asked me then, do you think you could make it to once a year or once every 2 years without filling up a load of garbage? I would have said absolutely impossible. And so this top level advice, it's not particularly specific, but it would have helped me a lot, is that when you start a marathon, you can't see the finish line when you start. But the best way to start is to take those first few steps, even if you're not sure how far they'll get you, because the first step leads to the second leads to the third, and so forth. But let's go to the other panelists. And what I'd like to start off with is if each of you can share what you do, what your passion is, and how that may be relevant to plastics. So we'll go in alphabetical order of first name, if that's okay. So that'll be Bethany, then Dawn, then, well, okay, Eric. So Eric is the Brooklyn Borough President, which is to say he's the mayor of the 4th largest city in the country. And when you book someone on a night of huge political import nationwide, we've been going back and forth. He may pop in the middle of this and then pop back out again. Apparently there's something later on tonight, very political. So it'll be Bethany, then Dawn. If Eric shows up, then Eric, and then James, and then Vincent. So if you could share a little bit of your background, what your passions are, and if or how that's relevant to the movie or plastics in general.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Bethany McLean. I'm a longtime journalist, and I guess in many ways I'm the oddest member of this panel. I'm not sure my background is that relevant to plastics. I sort of backed into being interested in this topic. I 4 years ago, or a bunch of years ago, started work on a book about fracking, and the key question that interested me about fracking was not so much an environmental question as it was an economic question, and that was how fracking was changing the world when it didn't make money, and the lack of profitability. And fracking was no secret among skeptics on Wall Street, who had been saying for many years, this business just simply doesn't make sense economically. We're putting billions of dollars into the ground and the profits aren't coming out. And my book was published in the fall of 2018, and it basically tried to explain how a business that didn't make any money could be having such a profound impact on our economy. And I wish I could say that I arrived at a really solid, clear answer on that. I didn't. I found it an interesting disconnect. But that, of course, while the book is very economic in nature rather than environmental in nature, that, of course, that first foray into it made me more and more interested in the environmental issues and in what the fracking industry was doing in order to promulgate plastics. Because if the fracking industry can't create more demand for their products, then they have no hope of ever making money. And that's particularly true today after what's happened with demand in the pandemic.
If you think you are unusual for the panel and maybe don't fit, I'm a professional sailboat racer. And I grew up in Michigan. I've sailed with my family when I was young. And then I've raced around the world twice and done 4 America's Cups. And I don't know exactly how or why I ended up becoming a strong individual. I guess you always go back to your parents, but maybe it's also the stress of being a sailor and not really being in control of your life and of the wind and of the race. So you figure that you need to fight harder than the average person. And that led me through the years for being able to take the right and take advantage of the right to go sailing and be a competitive athlete. And it also obviously puts me very much in touch with the oceans and the environment, because that is our fuel. Wind is our fuel. And I shared with Josh early on that I was aware of the plastics and problems in the ocean. The first time we raced around the world in 1989-90, we saw a piece of styrofoam out in the middle of the Atlantic. And it was so bizarre and unusual that it was almost interesting and entertaining. By the time we went around the world 4 years later, we saw plastic down, where you're supposed to be looking at the albatross across the Atlantic. And we actually lost the rudder in part because we had a big sheet of black plastic wrapped around the rudder, and that broke off. In the meantime, with all of that, I've been active on trying to make sure that sailing is open to men and women, to people of all ages, trying to get rid of the idea that it's supposed to be just for wealthy old white men. So that means that by default, I've been training different groups of people and kids. And so I've seen the same thing, that the kids would have known that you weren't supposed to throw trash on the street, but they go, oh, there's the water, and throw it off the dock. If you want to see me livid, that was when I would go a little bit crazy on them. So I've been able to see the ups and the downs between being out in nature, the beauty of it, and then be so disappointed when you see something like a plastic bag. And I just want to put one other thing in there, and I know Josh has told us some of the questions. Here in Long Island, where we're between New York and Connecticut, where I am at Oak Cliff Sailing right now, we have a lot of people around us. We have wind, we have rain, and the amount of garbage that I live on the beach, I've turned it into my workout. That's sad when you're doing squats and lunges to pick up garbage as you walk on the beach, when you should be enjoying, but I physically can't enjoy until the beach is clean. So it might seem, well, they think I'm crazy here, but even though it's not the right solution, you have to stop it at the source, at least I feel like I'm doing something.
It seems to be the tradition so far in the panel to explain how you're not connected to plastic first. So I'll just say that I'm a journalist, I'm an author. I've never specifically written about plastic, but I guess my area of fascination is the human relationship with nature. So that intersects with plastic at every turn. And I've written a book about local food and local food systems, another one about what I think of as the history of nature and how that's changed. And I'm currently working on a book about consumption and consumerism. All of those have intersected with plastic in one way or another. Probably the one that springs to mind in terms of connection is my most recent book, The Once and Future World. And there's an idea in there around shifting baselines, or this idea that we look around ourselves as we're growing up and we see a state of nature that we think of as normal, and that becomes our idea of the baseline state of nature. And then in recent decades anyway, we as we get older, we watch the natural world degrade. And then the next generation comes along and the degraded state of nature is their baseline. It's the new normal for them, and so on and so forth. And as you can imagine, the idea over the generations, you can see how we lose sight of what the natural world used to be like. And I think that's the kind of process that we see with plastic, that it's this process of it kind of creeps into our lives, and before we know it, it has taken over another role and another role and another role and become normal. And I think that's an area that I'm really interested in, is how do we normalize these environmental disasters?
I do have something to do with plastic because I work for Patagonia, and I have for the last 47 years, and about half of the clothing we make comes out of an oil well and becomes a polyester or a nylon. And it's been an obsession of our company for the past 25 years to try to reduce our environmental footprint, and then eventually, when we can, to create to give back in a positive way to the planet rather than simply reduce the harm we do. The waste story that we saw with plastic is a key component of what we might call the overall plastics problem, or the overall petroleum problem. And I think that one of the things, there are two things. One thing that the film really said to me, and something that our company is also working on, we really have to change the way things are made in order to minimize the waste, but we also have to reduce consumption, absolutely, because there's so much we don't know how to do in order to reduce the harm that needs to be done.
Now, part of me wants to say how, addressing Bethany and Dawn and James, how they said, I'm not sure how I belong here, but to me, in the movie, when I saw how much fracking is pushing plastic it just made me think of Saudi America. And with Dawn talking about the story, I've talked to a lot of people about their experiences with plastic, and I don't think anything gets me in the gut like hearing about sailors talking about being so far from the ocean, from land, and seeing it. And James, I've thought for most of my life, like if only we could return to how it was when I was a kid. And I realized that was, by that stage, we'd already lost so much wilderness. Vincent, you said at the end that you talked about the scenes in the movie that affected you. I wonder if, for anyone, but maybe if we could start with Vincent, what were some scenes in the movie that were meaningful to you or that affected you?
You know, there's much in the film that was familiar, but what was really unfamiliar and really caught my eye and I found horrific was the idea that so much of the garbage problem in Asia was 10 or 15 years old. That, and then when you actually look at it and you hear people talking, you know, the fellow next to the garbage plant who's a dairy farmer who says everybody's life is 10 to 15 years shorter. The contrast between seeing the actual effects in all of the industrial processes that we do that are that we cause to take place have a local effect. That, you know, these system-wide problems show up in a particular place. So one of the things about watching a movie, and I thought it was great that they went around the world and that you saw lots of different kinds of places. You saw what happened to the river, you saw what happened to the land. That's just the sight of it, I think, reinforced for me all day. I watched it 2 nights ago and then I finished it last night. And I've spent the last 2 days being almost unable to look at a plastic bag and thinking, anything I can do to keep this stuff out of the house, I will. But it all, of course, also raises the question, because I'm part of a company that deals with plastic every day. So how are we going to deal with these issues over time?
And did anyone else have a scene that affected them? And by the way, I'm seeing some questions coming in. So attendees, please feel free to put your questions into that we'll get to in a little bit. I think Dawn looks like she's about to say something.
The statement that the bulk of that was in the past 10 to 15 years also struck me, and I saw some other people nodding. That was incredible and crazy. But while I'm a fighter, I'm also an optimist. And my first reaction was like, 10 to 15 years, we can undo this, 10 to 15 years. Then you get, of course, to the big picture, but I'm internally optimistic, and I believe that we can make a difference. And Vincent, when you talk about plastic in the house and looking at plastic, my mom visited for the first time in a really long time, way before COVID. And she's like, "Oh, sweetie, do you have a plastic bag?" And I went, "No." And then I was proud. I was like, "No, I do not have a plastic bag in this house. Thank you very much." And of course, then she goes on and tells all of her friends. So it is the little things, even though it's so huge of the big thing.
It looks like James is about to say something.
Well, it really struck me, I mean, oddly enough, so many of us were struck by that same fundamental fact that this is a relatively, it's effectively a brand new problem historically, 10 to 15 years since we've seen these rivers in Asia and other parts of the world start to fill with garbage. And of course, from my perspective, I was looking at, putting myself in the boat with the woman in Indonesia going down the river. And I'm not just seeing the plastic, I'm seeing all the kids on the bank and thinking, a lot of kids there under 15, under 10 years old. And for them, this is the world they know. This is the rivers that they will know. And when you hear the fishermen talk about how 40% of the catch is now plastic objects, I think about the research into the size of fish and how you have fishermen, fishers from just the most who are only perhaps 20 to 30 years older than the fishers today, and they can describe oceans with far more fish and much larger fish that they were catching at that time. And then younger fishers who are like, listen to those old guys talk. Is that really how it was? I think this is the most terrifying thing about it to me, is that we can end up in this place where 15 years from now, people will think, was there ever a time when it wasn't like this, or is that kind of an abstract fairy tale that people talk about?
Hello, how's everyone?
Very good, Eric. How are you?
Quite well, doing well. Again, as mentioned, my name is Eric Adams. I am the Brooklyn Borough President. For those of you who live outside the city, I would be considered a county executive probably in your municipality. Brooklyn is the largest county in New York with 3.6 million people. 47% of them speak a language other than English at home. If we were a separate city, it would be the third largest city in America. And as you can imagine, as a city of that size, we use and consume a lot of plastic. We were extremely fortunate to have passed a piece of legislation that banned plastic bags in the state of New York. And we're excited about that legislation because it's going to start behavioral changes. I think I was invited on here to really talk about the modification of one's behavior, even if you are used to doing something for a long period of time. In 2016, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at an advanced stage that caused me to lose my vision in my left eye, and I was losing my right. The doctor said I was no longer legally able to blind because of the severity of my vision loss. I had permanent nerve damage in my hands and feet due to neuropathic nerve damage from the advanced stages of diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, had an ulcer, and I was just in really bad shape. Physically, I may have looked fine, but I had to take an internal selfie to realize that my body was breaking down. And I was able to go to an amazing doctor after seeing 5 of the best doctors here in the city who told me this was my new norm and I should just prepare myself for the eventual loss of limbs and toes and vision loss. But I was introduced to just changing my diet. And I went to a whole food plant-based diet. After 54 years of eating everything fried and greasy and sugary and processed, a retired police officer, after 22 years, and just to dispel the rumor, do police officers like donuts? Yes, we did. And I ate every type of donut you could imagine. But instantly, realizing the imperativeness of my health, I went to a whole food plant-based diet, and within 3 weeks, my vision returned. Within 3 months, my nerve damage went away, my diabetes went in remission, the ulcer went away, my body normalized, and my 82-year-old mother joined me after being diabetic for 15 years, 7 years on insulin. Mom joined me on a whole food plant-based diet, and after 2 months, Mom was cycled off her insulin. And so I share the story because many people believe that we can't change our behavior from needing plastic in our lives. We got so used to the disposable plastic bottles, the plastic bags, everything around us is plastic. And when you engage in this conversation and show people that when you want to do behavior changes, my behavior change did not only help my mother, but it helped Mother Earth. It starts to show the overconsumption of meat and dairy, how it is destroying our planet, just as plastic is destroying our planet. When we start mobilizing our young people and allow them to engage in this conversation, they're going to blow the winds of change. And so I thank you for the story of plastic. I think more and more people need to understand every time they pick up that water bottle, they're putting down our planet. We have become domestic abusers, and it's time for us to understand that we are all in this together. What we do to the planet Earth is what we're going to do to us. We come from the same universal core and center, and it's time to now normalize what's best for the planet and what's best for each other.
Thank you. And can I follow on with one quick question after that? Because after meeting you, I started seeing your name a lot more. And it's not just you changing yourself, because now, like I read, we can't just give food to kids without regard to, is it healthy food? Is it nutritious food? And so you're not just one person changing, you're changing government, you're changing the third largest city in the country. And you must have leaned on people before you who helped you along. And so everyone who, correct me if I'm wrong, but everyone who does something, it leads to more, it leads to community. I mean, I presume you built on people who came before you.
Well said, and so true. I believe that if we are fortunate to live long enough, we're going to be misfortunate to experience pain. And the question becomes, how do we turn pain into purpose? And throughout our lives, we're going to find ourselves in dark places. And we must make the decision if that dark place is a burial or a funeral, or is it a place where we were planted? And I think that when we go through difficult times, they're plantings. And if you lean on the people around you, the fruits of your harvest is going to feed others to ensure that they could be able to see themselves in a planting. And it's been those around me who have watered and nurtured me, and I leaned on. They allowed me to see the possibilities and outside those dark places. And so I think that this story of plastic is part of that. We're going to need each other to really educate, mobilize, and move our country to the right place. It's time to ensure the survival of our planet, not only for today's time, but for future generations.
What's something that you learned unexpected from the movie? I mean, we talked about some things, but is there anything that I just did not expect that at all? Maybe Dawn?
Actually, I think and I don't know if this is because, what is the social experiment, but I think what was most surprising to me is it seems like every time I turn on Facebook or CNN in the 2 days since I finished watching the movie, I'm finding new articles about other people. So again, staying on the positive, Burger King now has reusable cups, where 2 years ago, I couldn't take my cup into Starbucks because they said that they couldn't refill it because of being for health and safety. So I'm seeing the positive. The one thing that also did strike me, though, that was I found myself looking at the footage of the garbage in the water for a moment, trying to figure out, is that real? It was so unbelievable to me that there was that much there. I was like, no, surely it's the camera angle. And then it was pretty clear right away. And of course, it was like, give your head a shake. My friends have been there. They've seen this. They know this is real. But even somebody who's so positive and active in this and understanding the problem, it was so overwhelming that I couldn't quite believe it when I first saw it. I thought that was pretty scary.
I'm going to say something that I'm hoping is going to lead to Bethany saying something, because one thing that actually was unexpected to me was that there's this entire fossil fuel system that's entirely dedicated to plastic. I think my perception of it was more that oil is brought out of the ground and it goes to refineries and it goes off into the world and it becomes various things. Plastic is one of them. I wasn't really aware that there are now oil and gas fields connected to pipelines, connected to refineries, and that those entire that entire system of production is entirely connected purely to the plastics industry. And that really seems to me like an optimistic place to look to for something to change at a larger scale, because there's a lot, it's often highly controversial, obviously, to, for example, oppose a pipeline, because I think so many of us feel bound up in the energy system, and we recognize that we're dependent on energy in our lives to some degree. I don't think we feel the same way about plastics. And I think people would be, when we hear phrases like leave it in the ground, I think people would be a lot more prepared to leave it in the ground if they know that that particular oil or fossil fuel is just going to end up producing plastic bags.
I'm glad that you're optimistic about it, because Perhaps befitting my stance as a cynical and skeptical journalist, I came away rather pessimistic about it. I was struck just by the imagery in the movie, given that I deal in words and numbers probably too often. So being cast into images was interesting to me, but it made me think more broadly, per your point, James, that fracking unleashed this supply we didn't think we had. If you go back to the mid-2000s, we thought we were facing shortages both of oil and of natural gas. There were even congressional hearings as late as 2007, 2008, these hand-wringing hearings about these shortages of natural gas. And the advent of fracking unleashed this supply of natural gas that now people say we have a 100-year supply. But the very damaging thing about that is that it absolutely crushed prices. It's more supply than we need. So the fracking industry started looking for, what do we do with this excess supply in order to get the price back up so that we can make money. And so what I worry about is that the demand for plastics is almost going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I found this number after I watched the film. I started to do a little bit more research, and I found this number. Since 2010, companies have invested more than $200 billion in 333 plastic and other chemical projects in the U.S. Philadelphia alone has granted a $1.6 billion shell plant being built, a tax break valued at $1.6 billion, one of the biggest in state history because of all the jobs that are going to be created by this. And so I worry that it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the production of the plastics will lead to the demand for the plastics. I agree with you that way of I'm thinking as I talk that maybe there is a more optimistic way to think about this, because that split that you identified and pointed out hadn't occurred to me, and it's really interesting. That leave it in the ground. What about my iPhone? What about my car? What about my power? Well, if you think, what about my plastic? Well, no, right? And if you realize that in a sense these demands for plastic are essentially a subsidy for the fracking industry, right? It's such an odd and interesting web that by state governments giving these subsidies to companies in order to build these giant plastic plants that are going to create demand for natural gas that didn't otherwise exist. That's in a sense just another subsidy to the fracking industry, right? And perhaps if we were all just a little bit more aware about where the demand was coming from, maybe that could do something to change it. So there, I went from pessimistic to optimistic. One conversational whatever.
I'm going to interject here for a second that I do find that the more that I talk about this, the more that I act, the more that other people act, the more community forms, and the more that people start talking about solutions more than dwelling in the problems. Part of why this panel's here. Did anyone else want to share something that they learned unexpected?
One of the things that struck me was the number of volunteers who were out there and the different backgrounds that they came from to actually check on the rivers, the health of the rivers, and to work against the waste. I think there's still kind of an image in the U.S. particularly, but also in Europe, that when you're dealing with not so much with Japan and Korea, but when you're dealing with less developed areas in Asia, that we have to give these people a chance to develop the kind of lifestyle that we developed in the West, and that it's arrogant of us to talk about environmentalism. But what this was great in the film is what you saw was how people respond in the area they live, and it also just looked crazy what was coming into their water and into their fields. It didn't look like any kind of a strong benefit from the consumer economy that was going to transform their lives for the better. It was a nightmare.
There's one thing that just struck me as they were talking about the bays like that we are a bay and the water's coming into our and bringing the garbage into the bay. And again, people hear like, oh, it's Asia, they use too much plastic. Well, no, it was us selling the little tiny packets of olive oil. That was just insanity. And I came here to Oak Cliff today, this morning. I was like, you guys, there will be no more layered plastics in this building ever. If I see them, you're in trouble. There's already no water bottles, et cetera, et cetera. So at least I can be a little bit of a dictator here. But I mentioned that I live on Long Island Sound and I pick up garbage in the morning. And if one more person said, oh, thank you, sweetie, I wanted to punch them in the face. But there was one woman that stopped and she said, you know what? I think I'll do that. I was like, yes. And then she looks at me and she goes, you know, it comes from Connecticut. I'm like, no, this is an ocean. It's water. It comes from us and from them. So it's so easy, even here, New York, Long Island to Connecticut, thinking it's not really me. I'll help fix it, but it's not really me. It's every single one of us. And that's one of my messages when I go out, and I do get on tangents every once in a while. So you never know what's going to come out when I'm doing a speech to a corporation and all of a sudden I'm talking about picking up plastic.
If you don't mind me asking, what do the people from the corporations say, if you can share? Don't share anything too secret.
Oh, when they think I'm a little bit crazy, but by then I've enthralled them with stories of icebergs and whales. And so then I'm an authoritative figure on something, and then the ocean. Honestly, many, many times people in the audience will come up and say, thank you. You know, it's refreshing. I didn't think about that. So I figure every little bit.
And you guys have, so now going back to the group, you guys have alluded to this, but is there anything from your background that you wish that informs you about plastic that probably other people don't know that you wish people did know?
I think I struggle a little bit more with the issue than perhaps people might expect, because I grew up in a mining town, northern Minnesota, iron mining town. And so I see directly the jobs that were dependent on an extractive industry. And it makes it means that I have a little more, I have a little more of a I'm not sure it's possible to have necessarily I guess I have a multi-layered perspective on this, in the sense that when I see a state like Pennsylvania, as I'd mentioned, giving this $1.6 billion subsidy to a plant, and you know what that means in terms of jobs for people, I guess it feels a little more real to me. And I have an understanding of some of the trade-offs. So, and it's something that I think about with fracking too, that as much as I came out of my research on fracking being pretty opposed to the industry. After the financial crisis, the fracking industry created millions of jobs and enabled our economy to recover at a much better rate than it would have without those jobs. And that's going to be a huge tailwind coming out of the pandemic as the fracking industry is drying up. And I know none of this is a trade-off for the long-term, short-term well-being of the planet, but they are real issues that politicians have to wrestle with. So.
I think there's probably a 5-second portion of the film where they put up a chart that shows the growth in plastic production over, I think, since the mid 20th century. And maybe based on the research I've been doing in the last couple of years on consumption and consumerism, the thing that immediately struck me was that I've seen that chart before. And what I've seen it in is the growth of the economy, the growth of carbon emissions, the growth of various pollutants, the growth of deforestation. It's the same chart every time. And it has not only the same, it doesn't only rise at the same time, but it also stalls and sometimes declines at the same time. And those are always when the economy is in decline. So what I've been working on and thinking about over the last few years is the fact that all of these things are embedded in the same large system, which is a consumer economy built on perpetual growth. And it's led me to believe, and we're talking about plastic as a big problem, and I want to start talking about the consumer economy, the perpetually growing consumer economy as a problem. And obviously that's even more enormous in scale. But then the way I started to think about it is we've put enormous financial and social and technological effort, organizational effort into trying to make our scale of consumption green over the last 20, 25 years. And I think we could put the same kind of creativity, financial effort, organizational, social, technological effort into actually reducing consumption over the next couple of decades. If we can turn from that, from the greening narrative to the reducing narrative, then we deal with all of these problems at the same time.
Yeah, I'm starting to think of the changes in my life as I've gone to more of a 100-mile diet, as the title of your book. It's enriched my life in ways that I could not have predicted, but I could go on about that. I want to see if anyone else, Vincent, do you have anything that from your life that you wish others knew about plastic that they probably don't know?
Not so much. I'm the oldest person in the virtual room, and so I actually, it's interesting because I remember grew up pretty much without plastic. We had Bakelite steering wheels on the old 50s cars, but you didn't have plastic, a lot of plastic film or plastic packaging. But going back to James's point, I do think we need a two-pronged approach. I mean, they did talk in the film about developing bioplastics, which I know a little bit about from Patagonia and how complicated it is. But I do think we need to both green what we're doing and also do much less of what we're doing and figure out how to move the economy so that it's not based 77% on disposable consumer goods, because that is what's driving this very strange economy with its social and environmental destruction.
And Bethany, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was hoping actually just to jump in and ask Vincent a question, because I know Patagonia does things very differently than other companies, but it seems to me that corporate America is is going to be at war with this notion of reducing our consumer economy. And so how does Patagonia think about this when, from a corporate perspective, it'd be better to have more people buying more of your stuff, right? But from what the company stands for, it is not good to have people doing that. And how do you balance those two objectives? Because that's at the core of getting our world to move toward a consumption-oriented world, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have argued for about the past 15 years that people should buy less and buy higher quality and buy things that are going to last for a long time. At the same time that our business has been growing. And when we look at the environmental implications and we draw that 10 years out, we start to worry that almost everything we do to reduce our impact is a countervailing force of the growth. Aside from Patagonia, I know a couple of companies that are doing amazing things are very serious about reducing their environmental impact, and saw a lot of their trash in the film. When you're operating business at scale, even at the Patagonia's level, but when you get to companies that are 10 to 100 times our size, when you're operating at that scale, then and you're trying to maintain that business, that's when I think you have to have that's when it becomes very difficult for a company of even the best intentions to say, okay, we're not going to produce yogurt in cups, or we're not going to produce soda, which shouldn't be made in the first place, in plastic bottle. I mean, yeah.
Now I'm going to interject, and we're a little past when we're going to take questions from the audience, and but you guys are going, so I didn't want to stop it. But one of the questions is, are you planning any humanitarian projects to clean this up in your organizations or in your lives or in your work? And I'm going to start that myself, is that this is what this team has formed around. I mean, a long time ago, it was just me doing leadership in the environment, but now a team is formed of trying to change the feeling behind acting from, there's a lot of people saying, do this, do that, do this, do that. There's not a lot of people making people enjoy it, and to change from I have to do this to I get to do this. And so events like this is what we're getting started doing to try to bring what I call leadership to the environment to complement what there's a lot of management around this. But I wonder if any of you are doing things with organizations that you're working with or planning on participating in things on a bigger scale.
I'll just jump in since I always tend to jump in. We at Oak Cliff, like again, we're a training and coaching center, so we're training the youth that are going to the Olympics, America's Cups around the world. 2 of our graduates are on 11th hour racing, and so that is a high-tech carbon fiber boat, and they are taking a strong leadership and working with the ocean race on making the stopovers carbon neutral. They called me today to ask if how many people were flying where for the rest of the campaign from our team so that they could put that in. They're working on flax instead of carbon fiber. And I don't know if anybody's a sailor, but just think aerospace materials using flax, which isn't going to be as strong as carbon fiber, which of course is made from petroleum, but using it for places in the areas that it's not critical to have it super strong with those properties. It maybe has some more flexibility. And then the cool part is because they're taking the stance, they're doing the research and the technology and basically providing the IP to the other teams, they're going to then from below change the rules for the race. So it would be like somebody saying, we're gonna make better glass bottles and we're going to make everybody want them. And that is what then makes the local legislature say, okay, we're only allowing glass bottles. So it's a really unique situation and everybody's tied in, everybody takes the pledge. So yeah, 11th hour racing, they do a lot of other environmental stuff, but this is a around the world race that will go to all of the places that you see in the film, especially in China and Hong Kong and South America. And they will have that message to all of those countries.
Do I also read that the culture of sailing has shifted? Like this is a major issue. I mean, whenever I see videos of ocean racing, there's always at least one boat that is like, this is the no plastic or something like that they're promoting.
Because you see it, because you're out in this pristine area. As I said, to see an albatross is like a once in a lifetime thing. When you're going around the world, these huge, majestic, like gigantic seagulls just cruising along and skimming, 40-foot seas. And then to see plastic next to it, or to race down Long Island on the Block Island race, which is after graduation and Father's Day, and see balloons all the way through the sound. That's just disgusting. So we see it and we're there. Now, to be totally clear, and Vincent has some of the same situation, we do make boats out of fiberglass. We do have boats made out of carbon fiber. We use resins, but every single person who's there trying to, we see it, so we try to make it better. And I want to point out the America's Cup and the Round the World race, that is the epitome of the competition. So you don't want to give up 1/100th of a second to another person, but somehow if we're all in this together and we're making a difference for the environment, we're okay with that.
Anyone else want to go next? And by the way, I want to mention that question was from Margaret Russo from the audience.
I'd just like to mention that, to Don's point, that there's a certain level when you're trying to change the way industry works, that securing the cooperation of the whole industry, how do you change the way boats are made? How do you change the rules for races so that you do everybody gives up 100th of a second in order to reduce the use of a certain fiber? So for Patagonia, I'll give you an idea of the complexity. We're really committed to getting out of the use of virgin oil in polyester and nylon, which is about half the line. And 85% of our environmental impact is in the fabrics we create. However, even if we use bio-based materials or go to 100% recycled plastics, then we have the issue of where the mills are located, and whether they're using coal to run their plants. So you have a this is again why I'm arguing that on the one hand, you have to change your practices, and on the other hand, as James is talking about, you really just need to reduce overall consumption, because some of the changes that need to take place are going to affect our children, or they're going to affect us in 10 or 15 years, but we need to stop ruining our planet a lot sooner than that. We don't have that long. So it's really a combination of changing the way we do things and doing less and buying less. Just a brief statement. I remember, we talked about this, Josh, in the early days of the shutdown, this sense of nature coming back. I had that in my town when all of a sudden there was no freeway noise. There was, the air was a color blue in Southern California that I had never seen before. You almost had the sense of the trees kind of leafing out in a more spectacular fashion, that everything that they could breathe as well as we could breathe. And that gets to your point about experiencing joy when something else happens. So you have to create that opportunity for people, that they are actually, there's a natural world that's very beautiful, that's been hidden increasingly for the last 100 years as the baseline has shifted. So we've got to see more of that. We've got to give up some of these conveniences, and at the same time change what we produce.
I can't help but think that that might have affected James, and I'm going to pick on you next. Is there anything that you foresee coming? I mean, you have a book coming out. I'm not sure if that relates, but are there any humanitarian projects coming up that you have in mind or that you know going on?
None that I'm launching. I mean, launching a book is plenty for me at the moment. But I mean, I do see through this book, I have seen what I think are the initial hints in the wind of a shift in the narrative from this discussion around, how do we make our products more recyclable, or how do we make the production of them have a lower impact, and more towards, I can see a discussion starting to happen around, well, how do we make things last longer? How do we make things more repairable? How do we construct systems that discourage the consumption of so many products? And as I've worked on it, the thing that that's really sunk in for me is that while I'm a big supporter of people changing their individual behavior, and it's something that I've done, and I've found valuable in the same ways that I think you did, Josh, around, changing to a primarily local food diet doesn't feel like punishment or putting on the environmental hair shirt to me. It's exactly the way that I want to eat. It's the best way to eat that I've ever experienced. That's why I do it. But at the same time, I just think it's very difficult to change systems through individual choices, and much more effective to do it through organized efforts to generate new business models, change the way we use technologies, change the way we govern and regulate. All of these sorts of things, I think, are ultimately going to be much more effective.
Thank you. And as we go to Bethany, I give you a choice of answering that question. There's also a question from Chris that's perfect for you, which is, what were the citations for the lack of profitability of fracking that you highlighted? And so answer that, the question before of initiatives, or both. And if you don't plug Saudi America overtly, then I will. So make sure to put that in there.
So the lack of profitability of the fracking industry is pretty well understood at this point. When I wrote about it in 2018, it was not as well understood, but it's pretty incontrovertible at this point. If you look at all the major fracking companies, all the publicly traded companies, the industry has never produced free cash flow, which is the sort of most basic level of profitability. And in fact, has been, even during years when oil and gas prices has been high, has lost tens of billions of dollars. And that's part of why when you saw fracking, when you saw the industry really crash this spring, it was a reflection, yes, of the pandemic affecting demand and a reflection of some of the geopolitical navigating between Saudi Arabia and Russia. But it was also a reflection of this growing skepticism in the investment community toward fracking companies because of their inability to produce profits. So the book documents the lack of profitability in the industry, but if you just Google it now, it's almost conventional wisdom that the business, that the industry doesn't make money. Let's see, as to initiatives, I'm a freelance journalist, so I wish I could give you some great initiative I was undertaking. I'm trying to be a lot more aware in my personal life of these issues and bring a lot more awareness through the work I'm doing. I guess one thing I worry about that is not directly responsive to the question, but that I've been thinking a lot about, and maybe people have opinions on this, is whether the ways in which the pandemic has altered our behavior, whether they are helpful or hurtful. And one of the things I worry about coming out of the pandemic is that we're going to have big business winning at the expense of local business, given that the pandemic is costing so many local businesses their existence. And if you have big business, Amazon, et cetera, winning at the end of the day, and all that's left, and that's a little bit of a that's obviously hyperbole, it's overstatement, but it's not that much of an overstatement. And so I worry that these forces that feel beyond our control, like our response to the pandemic, are taking this in the opposite direction in which we would, from what we would all want. So I'm trying to be very, very, very aware of that of that cost and think through it in my next book project. So
now we're just at the end, and I don't want to go over too much, but I do want to give people a chance to give a closing statement. And I want to say something, which is to thank each of you for being here to share on a topic that, plastic is unavoidable, and to put yourself out there and talk about it, something that everyone agrees is a big problem, but we can't help doing, to me, is allowing yourselves to be vulnerable. And with my leadership background, like, that is a big piece of leadership. And I thank you for allowing yourselves to put yourselves out there. Do any of you have a closing statement that you would like to leave the audience with?
I was just thinking as we were talking about, again, random, the things that have just jumped out at me is, in the past year, I've gotten in a fight with Verizon because they told me I had to upgrade my cable box because it was too old. And I said, but there's nothing wrong with it. That was an interesting situation. I kept my old iPhone until it got run over in a car crash. And I had a person that came to me and said, basically, he was a wealthy individual. He meant well. He said, so with COVID, do you feel that the grocery prices are out of control? And I said, I don't know. I've been gardening. I learned how to grow sweet potatoes from a piece and some celery from a head, and I have my seeds, and I haven't been to the grocery store for pretty much anything. And then the final thing I want to say is, Vincent, when you said a time before plastic, all I could think of is this cute little glass containers that I use to store my extra food with the glass lids. And every time I use that, I'm happy. And so I think you're onto something where we were talking about nature and going back, and the nostalgia and the quality. And that is potentially a way out of this plastic. And then anybody that wants to go sailing, call me.
And just in relation to that, I actually think there's this business about small businesses going under is really serious. And I think that overall, one of the ways in which we need to address the environmental and social crisis is to make local business much healthier and much larger force, economic force than it is, because the globalization hides problems. It also deprives communities of agency. But the other thing, and just a little warning, not that we need anything to worry about. I was reading in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday an article by a professor at Yale who studied previous pandemics and plagues, and said that often with a plague, you do have a kind of more sober behavior coming out of it. So I think there's a huge opportunity for that, for people to look and say, you know, what we have developed, the economy we have developed doesn't feel very real. It doesn't feel very good. But he also warned with a letter from like 1328 from a barber who was writing in his diaries that about 3 years after the plague is over and people can feel expensive again, that they go a little bit nuts. He's talking about the nuns and the monks running riot in the 14th century. So the trajectory over the next couple of years, I think this is a time to take advantage of for those of us who feel that the world should be moving back toward the health of the planet and the health of human beings. But we should also be mindful that we could have a reaction in a few years that would reconsolidate those forces.
I think I would just, I'm kind of reiterating what I said earlier, but I think it's really helpful to, even though plastic the production of plastic is this giant system, I think it's really useful to think of that system as being embedded in an even larger system, which is this one of the consumer economy, you know, the perpetually growing consumer economy as the way we run our world. And, you know, we've talked tonight about we've pointed at least towards some of the things that some of the ideas that can address that, like localism, the economy of quality rather than constantly concerning ourselves with how quickly it's growing. Bethany talked a bit about how, you know, addressing fossil fuel subsidies. And then I think there's just this leap of imagination at the end of all of it. You know, Vincent and Dawn talked about the time before plastic. And, you know, now can we imagine the time after plastic? I think that's where we should try and cast our minds in a situation like this.
I wish I could keep talking to all of you for longer and longer. We're just past 8 o'clock. So I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank all the attendees for participating as well. And please go and listen to each of their conversations on the Leadership Now, This Sustainable Life podcast. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone. It was great to be with you.
Thank you. It's a delight.
Thanks so much.